Elizabeth was certain that the cell was the basement her father had been building before. If no one could hear her shouts, then ... The pipes connected to the entire building. In Elizabeth's house, the ground floor was used to finance it, while the second and third floors were converted into flats and rented out by Joseph. So Elizabeth bet on strange tenants, the Fritz flat. It would be great to get their attention and then be rescued. So, Elizabeth began frantically banging on the pipes in the basement while Joseph was away. At her insistence, the upstairs tenants finally began to complain to Joseph. The tenants said that the pipes in the house sometimes made strange noises and that something was not working. Joseph hastened to explain that the whole building had been built in 1870, and it was inevitable that there would be some deterioration and repairs would be made as soon as possible. His explanation was reasonable, so the tenants did not think much of it. Thus, Elizabeth's first escape plan failed, and she paid a terrible price for it. That day, Joseph came to the basement in a rage, beating her hard and cursing her. He beat Elizabeth to the point that she was crying and begging for mercy in order to put an end to the idea of escape. But that wasn't all. Joseph simply switched off all the power to the basement and left Elizabeth in complete darkness for days. It was the middle of winter, and the basement, in addition to being dark, was damp and cold. Elizabeth, shivering, hated her father beyond measure. She wanted to yearn for an escape and wanted to uncover the true nature of this beast. So, Elizabeth began to keep an eye out for the coded door to the basement. Every time Joseph came to the cell, Elizabeth would hear the door open 8 times in a row. 2 of them were coded doors. But again, Elizabeth was doubting that even if she was lucky enough to kill her father, she was afraid that she would not be able to escape from the basement. What she expects most is for her mother, Rosemary, to discover her father's secret and free herself. But as it turns out, no one can save her but herself. Translated with deepl.com free version. The time came in August 1986 when Elizabeth had already been imprisoned for 2 years. By this time, Elizabeth had been in captivity for 2 years. After numerous rapes, she was devastated to discover that she was pregnant. She was pregnant with her own and her father's child. This reality was a huge psychological shock to Elizabeth. She was extremely disgusted with her body and the product of incest in her womb, and her heart constantly resisted the reality. She cried incessantly and at the same time desperately beat her belly. After 10 weeks of pregnancy, Elizabeth had a miscarriage. And the great pain that the miscarriage brought to Elizabeth made her think of suicide and relief for the first time. But how could Joseph let her die? A year later, Elizabeth discovered, to her despair, that she was pregnant again. This time, she was much calmer. After learning of his daughter's pregnancy, Joseph very coldly threw her a 1960s birthing book and a pair of dirty scissors. The idea was simply to leave her alone in her cell to give birth. Joseph was like a cheap John. He tortured his daughter, deliberately impregnated her, and made her face the most dangerous moment in a woman's life on her own. On the 30th of August, 1988, his daughter Christine was born. It was this ill-fated child that brought hope and change to Elizabeth. The birth of her daughter Kristen gave Elizabeth the courage to go on living. She did not want her poor daughter to be her successor after her death and be violated by Joseph. So she learnt from books about caring for babies while struggling on the brink of a mental breakdown. On the 1st of February 1990, Elizabeth gave birth to her second child. This child was a boy named Stephen. After this, Elizabeth also lived a steady life of having a baby every 2 years. She was either pregnant or on her way to a forced pregnancy. On the 29th of August, 1992, a third child, Lisa, was born. With more and more children, the already small dungeon became even more cramped. So Elizabeth repeatedly asked Joseph to expand the dungeon to give the children a place to sleep. In a rare act of generosity, Joseph agreed to his daughter's request to expand the dungeon. But for his own safety, he does not give Elizabeth and the children any tools. Want to dig? Use your hands. Without any negotiation conditions, Elizabeth and her children could only use their hands to expand the cell from 35 square meters to 55 square meters. Structure of the basement. The extra space allowed for 2 beds for the children. Despite the very small space, Joseph gave full play to his construction talents and strengths as an engineer. He used a thick layer of cork as wallpaper on the weak corridor walls as a way of insulating them from outside sound. At the same time as the underground extension, Joseph converted the courtyard into a swimming pool. This allowed the earth dug out of the ground to be mixed with the earth used to dig the pool for the purpose of concealment. Only after the pool was built, the seepage from the dungeon walls became worse. Especially in the cold winter, the environment in the basement was almost like being in an ice cave, cold to the bone. Meanwhile, Joseph wasn't idle. As he watched Lisa crawling around on the floor, he had other ideas. In May 1993, he once again brought a pen and paper and threw them in front of his daughter Elizabeth, telling her to write a letter. Elizabeth picked up the paper and quietly constructed a letter that she wanted to make seem like a normal plea for help, but one that would be obvious if she read it carefully. But Joseph saw straight through her. He gripped his daughter by the hair and warned her fiercely to write as she had said, and not to change a word. Afterwards, Joseph quietly placed Lisa and the note on his doorstep. While it was still light, the little baby was cold and hungry, and it didn't take long for it to cry. Rosemary, who heard the baby crying, rushed to open the door and found the swaddling clothes on the doorstep and the baby inside.